What up, Mr. Ramziel? We got Vaseline under my eyes. We're recording this video. Get yourself comfortable. We're talking about Hugo Chavez. Okay. So, background of Venezuela pre-Chavez. At the beginning of the 20th century, Venezuela had one of the poorest economies in Latin America. But by 1970, it became the richest country in the region and one of the 20th richest countries in the world. The country is home to the world's largest oil reserves. Venezuela is an example of a petrostate, where the government is highly dependent on fossil fuel income, power is concentrated, and corruption is widespread. Petrostates are vulnerable. The government develops an unhealthy dependence on natural resource exports to the detriment of other sectors. It's very economic. Venezuela continues to grapple with economic and political hardship under President Nicolas Maduro, but U.S. sanction relief in exchange for democratic reforms have sparked hope for revival of the oil industry. That is a quote by Harari. In 1922, in the Maracaibo oil basin, a Dutch shell geologist discovered oil. After the discovery of oil, it accounted for 90% of exports in the 1930s. 3 companies controlled 98% of the oil outcomes in the country. In response, the government implemented the hydrocarbons law that required foreign companies to give half of their oil profits to the government, increasing the government income. In 1960, Venezuela joined OPEC and established the first state oil company. Following this, the 1970s had a great economic boom. That's when my mother lived in Venezuela in the 1970s. All went well until the 1980s, when oil prices dropped and the economy plummeted. In 1992, Hugo Chavez led a failed coup and rose to fame. Chavez was popular and elected in 1998 on a socialist platform. So we're going to get into the juicy details on the history of Hugo Chavez. Born in 1994, in the Barinas provinces of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez grew up poor. As a teenager, Chavez was heavily influenced by José Esteban Ruiz Guevara, a local historian who introduced him to the teachings of Bolivar and Karl Marx. Bolivar was he's very famous in Venezuela and all over Latin America for freeing them. The German philosopher who was one of the fathers of communism, both of which had an impact on Chavez's political philosophy. The president of the National Liberation Armed Forces, Fuerzas Armadas de Liberación Nacional, or the FALN, that began fighting the Venezuelan government in the 1960s, also greatly affected Chavez. The FALN was supported by the Cuban leader Fidel Castro, who would later become Chavez's political muse. This is a quote by Nelson, and this kind of ties into what Susanna's was about. Chavez became a career military officer and, after becoming dissatisfied with the Venezuelan political system, he founded the Revolutionary Bolivarian Movement, or the MBR-200, in the 1980s. Chavez led the MBR-200 in its unsuccessful coup d'etat against the democratic government of President Carlos Andrés Pérez in 1992, for which he was imprisoned. Pardoned from prison 2 years later, he founded the Fifth Republic Movement political party, which gained popularity, and was elected president of Venezuela in 1998. Chavez was elected president on a socialist platform, pledging to use Venezuela's vast oil field to reduce poverty. While his costly Bolivarian missions expanded social services and cut poverty by 20%, he also took several steps that precipitated a long and steady decline in the country's oil production, which peaked in the late 1990s and early 2000s. That's a quote. His decisions to fire thousands of experienced PDVSA workers who had taken a part in the industry strike in 2002 to 2003 gutted the company of important and technical expertise. Beginning in 2005, Chavez provided subsidized oil to several countries in the region, including Cuba, through an alliance known as Petrocaribe, or Caribbean oil. Over the course of Chavez's presidency, which lasted until 2013, oil reserves dwindled and the government debt more than doubled. A quote by Nelson. Chavez also harnessed his popularity among the working class to expand the powers of the presidency and edge the country towards authoritarianism. He ended the term limits, effectively took control of the Supreme Court, harassed the press and closed independent outlets, and nationalized hundreds of private businesses and foreign-owned assets, such as oil projects run by ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips. The reforms have paved the way for Maduro to establish a dictatorship years later after Chavez's death, who is the current president. The social impact on Venezuela through Chavez. Although socialist, domestic programs focused on educating the population. During his presidency, the literacy rate increased nationwide. Another social impact of Chavez was censoring the media through state-controlled television and attempted control of private communications, like phones. Chavez had many supporters as he replaced oil company technocrats with supporters of the government, increased minimum wages, and many social programs. All of these programs were funded with new oil money. Political impact on Venezuela. Chavez was described as a leftist. He was an anti-capitalist. Hugo Chavez defined his political position as Bolivarianism, I guess, or Bolivarianism, I don't know. An ideology he developed from that of Simón Bolívar. Chavez ruled a socialist government as there were elections in Venezuela. He was liked by the people, though, at the beginning of his presidency, but many saw through the cracks and decided to leave Venezuela before its collapse, such as my mother, an educated Venezuelan. Chavez left the country in an economic shambles and in a position to be taken and ruled by former member of his council, Nicolas Maduro, who is now bordering communism. The economic impact, the real meat and potatoes of Hugo Chavez. From his election in 1998 until his death in March 2013, Chavez's administration proposed and enacted populist economic policies. The social programs were designed to be short-term, though after seeing political success as their result, Chavez made the efforts to central his administration and often overspent outside of Venezuela's budget. Due to increasing oil prices in the early 2000s, which reached funds not to be seen in Venezuela since the 1980s, Chavez created the Bolivarian Mission, aimed at providing public services to improve economic, cultural, and social conditions. Using these populist policies in order to maintain political power, according to Carlson Penfold, aid was dispersed to some of the poor, and more gravely in a way that ended up helping the president and his allies and cronies more than anyone else. The missions, which were directly overseen by Chavez and often linked to his political campaigns, entailed the construction of thousands of free medical clinics for the poor and the enactment of food and housing subsidies. The quality of life Venezuelans had also improved temporarily according to the UN index. Chavez's popularity strongly depended on the lower classes who had benefited from these health initiatives and similar policies. Following elections, social programs saw less attention from the government and their overall effectiveness decreased. It's a quote by Levitsky, that whole paragraph. Chavez's populist policies eventually led to economic crisis in Venezuela. The social works initiated by Chavez's government relied on oil products, the key of the Venezuelan economy, with Chavez's administration suffering from Dutch disease as a result. Venezuela's economy was extremely vulnerable to changes in the oil prices, as since 2012, 96% of the country's exports and nearly half of its fiscal revenue relied on oil production, while by 2008, exports of everything but oil collapsed. The Chavez administration then spent governmental proceeds to the high oil prices on his populist policies to gain the approval of other voters. Economists say that the Venezuelan government's overspending on social programs and strict business policies caused imbalances in the country's economy, contributing to the rise of inflation, poverty, and low healthcare spending on shortages in Venezuela and going into the final years of his presidency. This is for the social. After enacting a new constitution with ample human rights protections in 1999 and surviving a short-lived coup d'etat in 2012, Chavez and his followers moved to concentrate power. They seized control of the Supreme Court and undercut the ability of journalists, human rights defenders, and other Venezuelans to exercise fundamental rights. And that is from a book, Venezuela, Chavez, Authoritarian Legacy. In conclusion, he was an interesting guy, to say the least.